Namaste children, welcome back to another session with me. Today I want you to open your supplementary text, It So Happened. Turn to page 55, Unit 7. The topic that we will be looking into today is titled The Open Window, a short story written by Saki. This story is divided into 3 parts. Before we get into the details, let us know a little about Saki. Saki was the pen name of the British writer Hector Hugh Munro, also known as H. H. Munro. He was born in Burma, the present-day Myanmar, in 1870. He is considered by many to be a master of short stories and is often compared to O. Henry and Dorothy Parker. His famous works include the classic stories Tobermory and The Open Window. Have you ever played a prank on your friends or family? Or have you been a target of these pranks? Or do you make up stories that others tend to believe? Not lying, of course, just imaginative, creative ones. Well, let me tell you that we are going to delve into one such simple story, a satirical comedy springing from the brilliant imagination of a 15-year-old girl. Now, this story talks about how one's nerves affect his or her personality. We are introduced to 4 characters. 1. Mr. Frampton Nuttall. 2. A 15-year-old girl named Vera. 3. Mrs. Sappleton. And 4. Mr. Frampton Nuttall's sister. The setting is the countryside. As Frampton embarks on a trip to the country intended as a nerve cure, he finds himself in the midst of a very unfamiliar situation which ultimately has negative effects on his personality. Frampton is welcomed by a 15-year-old girl who seems very self-possessed and is the niece of the lady of the house. She tells him that he has to put up with her company till her aunt comes down. But he doubts whether such formal visits to the houses of total strangers would help him cure his nerve. He suddenly recollects his sister's words and the letters of introduction that she has given him. The girl asks him if he knows anybody around in the country. Frampton says that she lived there 4 years before and that she knew a few people around in the town. She has also given him letters of introduction so that he may use it to get acquainted with the people that she knew. Now the niece interrupts. The sister of Mr. Frampton believes that if she does not hand him the letters of introduction, then he would sit in the house all day and mope, not talking to anyone. The niece proceeds to ask Frampton if he knows anything about her aunt. Frampton says that he knows nothing except her name and address. As he wondered whether she was widowed or married, the niece breaks his reverie and talks about a tragedy which occurred 3 years ago. As he wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton was widowed or married, there seemed to be a masculine presence in the room where he sat. Breaking the silence, the niece explains about a tragedy that occurred 3 years ago. She asks Frampton if he was wondering why the French window was wide open that October afternoon. She says that 3 years ago to the day, Mrs. Sappleton's husband and her 2 young brothers went out for shooting, but they never returned as they seemed to have drowned in a treacherous bog. Their bodies were never recovered, but Mrs. Sappleton, her aunt, leaves the window open on this day, praying that the 3 men, along with their brown spaniel, may return home. I quote, "Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back some day, they and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. Before we move on to part 2, we have 3 questions to answer. I will help you with the first one. Question 1. Why had Frampton Nuttall come to the rural retreat? Answer. Frampton Nuttall had poor nerves and the rural retreat was intended to cure the same. Question 2. Why had his sister given him letters of introduction to people living there? Question 3. What had happened in the Sappleton family as narrated by the niece? Presently, Mrs. Sappleton comes down and asks Frampton whether her niece has been keeping company. Frampton says that Vera is a very interesting girl. Now, Mrs. Sappleton unintentionally confirms the story that Vera has already explained about. She says that presently her husband and her 2 young brothers, along with their brown spaniel, have gone out for shooting and that they will return any time soon through that open window. Mr. Frampton gets to know that Mrs. Sappleton is completely engrossed in her story, and as she spoke in length about the season, the shooting, the scarcity of birds, Frampton at once knew that she wasn't paying much attention to his presence and proceeds to tell her about his illness. This does not amuse Mrs. Sappleton, and all of a sudden she becomes alert when she sees the men and says that they are there on time for tea. After hearing this, Frampton, who is wide-eyed and slightly shivering, looks out the window and to his shock sees the men and their dog proceeding towards the window. He turns towards Vera, who is also looking out the window in a state of shock. He turns towards Vera, who stares out the window in horror. Now Frampton believes strongly that he has seen ghosts. I quote, Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I say, Bertie, why do you bound?" Now we have 2 questions to make you think. Will you answer them? Question 1. What did Mrs. Sappleton say about the open window? Question 2. The horror on the girl's face made Frampton swing around in his seat. What did he see? Part 3. Frampton, who sees this, picks up his hat and his stick and rushes past the door into the gravel drive. His situation is worse. Now Mrs. Sappleton is also shocked at this behavior. Mr. Sappleton, who sees this, asks her who he was. She says that he is one Mr. Frampton Nuttall who has left as if he has seen a ghost. The niece interrupts calmly and explains, or rather creates a counter story, that Mr. Nuttall is horrified of dogs, and when he saw one, he bolted. I quote, Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noticed stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "He could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. I expect it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance at short notice was her speciality. Now let us look into the exercises, which is for your homework. Question 1. Why did Frampton rush out wildly? Question 2. What was the girl's explanation for his lightning exit? So children, what do you think about this story? Do you think it was fair on the part of the girl to weave a story and to talk in length about something that never happened, knowing that it could affect a person's health or his vulnerability? Do you think she could have been more sensitive towards his unfavorable circumstances? She was not just a good narrator, but a wonderful actor as well. This story is brilliantly crafted, but it also makes us wonder whether practical jokes are fun or mean. Well kids, it's time to go, and I think you're doing a wonderful job reading many books during your free time. Until we meet next, have a great day.